When you don't get the verdict that you want, what do? You appeal. There we go. You appeal. You try to go to a higher court, don't you? And also, I was looking this up, different states do different things with their different courts. They assign different levels of cases, but essentially there are different levels of courts for different levels of cases. And certain courts cannot give out certain types of penalties because they can't hear certain types of cases. It has to be brought up to the next level of court. So that's kind of why these last couple of weeks in this series of the last 24 hours I talked about, Jesus started off at the county court, the local Yahoos, the local guys, the Jews, the leaders of the temple. But they realized that the punishment that they wanted to hand out was beyond their authority. So they said, we got to kick this up to the next level of court. And so they kicked it up to Pilate's court, which I call the district court, or the regional Yahoos. So that's where we are today. This is essentially what's happened to Jesus. Jesus' case has been kicked up to a higher court so that they could go for the day. That's essentially what is happening. So we're actually continuing on from last week. Last week's kangaroo court, the court that was decided before it ever happened. You know, to get 70 leaders together in the middle of the night and come to a unanimous decision, that had to have been decided beforehand. And now that it's becoming daybreak, they are all bringing Jesus over to Pilate. This is first thing in the morning, probably 6 in the morning as the sun's showing up, and they're over there at Pilate's palace, knocking on the door saying, hey, we got a case for you. I would imagine judges and people like Pilate don't really enjoy being woken up at 6 o'clock in the morning to have to preside over a case like this. But this is a special case. It's a special holiday. It was Passover. It was a time when there was a lot of people in town, and Pilate wanted to keep everything quiet and smooth, and it'd be a nice, quiet holiday, and not have too many people thrown in the paddy wagon and too many people there. He wanted it quiet. He wanted everything to go smooth. So Pilate hears this case. And so they bring the charges. They bring the charges up against Jesus, and they said, he was guilty of perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself was the Messiah, a king. Well, those crimes are a little bit different than what they convicted him of just a few hours earlier in the middle of the night. They convicted him earlier of blasphemy. When he said, I am, they said, they tore their shirt, and they said, we could convict him on this right now. It's blasphemy. But here they're telling Pilate that he's perverting our nation. He's forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor. They're changing the charges here on a little bit. Because they know that they've got to have something that is against the Roman law, not against just their local law. They've got to have Jesus breaking some Roman law for him to be able to stand trial before Pilate. So they kind of change the charges a little bit here. And Pilate smells a rat. He says, something's going on here. So his first thing is he says, all right, we're going to send him over to Herod. Now Herod is one of the sons of King Herod the Great, the last real king of Judea. His sons were the territory that was his kingdom was broken up into 3 different pieces, and some of his sons were given those pieces. They were not given the title of king. They were given the title of prefect, or kind of a regional governor, you might say, over an area. Herod's area was up in the Galilee area. It was not in Jerusalem. That was Pilate's area. Pilate was a Roman governor over Jerusalem. But Herod's area was up from the Galilee area, which is one of the reasons that Pilate sent him to Herod, is because he was from Galilee, Nazareth. So he said, send him over to Herod. Well, Herod wanted to meet him. Herod wanted to see if Jesus would do a miracle. He'd been hearing about this guy all this time. And he questions Jesus, and Jesus is silent. Doesn't say anything. Doesn't even respond to Herod. What would you suppose he did? We'll come back to that in a minute. So Herod sends him back. They mock him a little bit, put a kingly robe on him, and send him back to Pilate. Basically saying, I don't have any jurisdiction on this one. him, I'm going to send him back to you. Let Pilate, you make the decision on what's going to happen on this one. So Pilate questions him. Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus replies, you say so. Now this is one of those times that I wish that we could hear how that phrase was said, because it could mean several different things. You know, it could be said very sarcastically, you say so. But I don't believe that was in Jesus' nature. It could be just a statement of, well, everybody else says you say so. But I believe Jesus was really saying it more in a tone of, you, Pilate, have the authority to say whether I am the king of the Jews or not. You say so. You have to say so. So then Pilate goes on and questions him some more and says, listen to all these charges that they're bringing against you. Don't you have anything to say? Jesus is silent. Again, why would he be silent? We'll come back to that a little bit. And then Pilate stands up and he says, I really don't find any basis for the charges. And neither does Herod. Herod didn't find anything. We don't find any reason for him to be given the death penalty. Now, why would you suppose that Herod and Pilate would not want to find him guilty? It's not because they're afraid to inflict the death penalty, and Herod actually had the ability to give the death penalty himself, because he was the Herod that had John the Baptist's head cut off. So he does have the authority to do that. And Pilate had the authority to do that. But I believe that they didn't want to do that because they saw that the priests, the chief priests, the leaders of the Jewish people, they were trying to usurp some power. They were trying to tell them what to do. And Herod and Pilate, they weren't particularly fond of the Jewish religion. They were not particularly religious people. Matter of fact, Pilate is, in historical writings, I've got one here from Philo, he was shown to have been actually quite vindictive against the Jews and the Jewish people. Philo wrote that Pilate had a vindictiveness and a furious temper, and that he was naturally inflexible, and he had a blend of self-will and relentlessness. Philo continued to write that Pilate feared that if the Jewish leaders actually sent an embassy to Rome, that it would expose the rest of his conduct as governor by stating about the full briberies, the insults, the robberies, the outrages, the wanton injuries, the executions without trial that were continually repeated. So evidently, Pilate had a reputation of inflicting judgment without trial and being harsh to the Jews. Actually, he was dismissed in the year 37 for being particularly harsh against the Samaritans during a particular event. He was harsh on the Samaritans, so the emperor called Pilate back. Pilate wasn't a nice guy. But 3 times he says, I find no basis for this man's judgment to be given the death penalty. Herod said the same thing. They did not want to give in to the pressure or the wants of the chief priests. So Pilate pulls out his last card. He says, okay, I got this tradition of releasing somebody, letting somebody go. And this was his tradition that he had done to make everything smooth and quiet on Passover, to make everybody go, hey, Pilate's not that bad of a guy. So he says, surely this is my chance to let Jesus go. All right, I will let somebody go. You want to let Barabbas or Jesus go? And to Pilate's surprise, they said, let Barabbas go. Now, Barabbas in Scripture, we are told, is a murderer, a thief, and that he led an insurrection. That means he was leading a revolt. He had people that were following him. They had some kind of skirmish. They probably killed some Romans in the midst of the skirmish, and he Messiah in the Jewish people's minds, what they thought of when they heard the term Messiah was a king. Somebody to come and to deliver them, to be their leader, just like King David was. A return of King David, a return of a strong king who could lead the people. And in this time period, to get them away from the Roman occupation, to deliver them from the Romans. So here you've got somebody who was leading an insurrection. And then you got Jesus, who is accused of leading an insurrection. And so they say, let Barabbas go. If we think in the corporate world today, and we think about the world of being an investor, a stockholder in a particular company or whatever, and let's say that company is doing poorly. And the board of directors says, we're going to bring in a new CEO to try to turn things around. There's a term in the corporate world for the CEOs that come in and make hard cuts, make hard decisions, called a hatchet CEO. They are brought in particularly to make the hard decisions, sell off divisions, make layoffs and cuts and reductions in force, and do the things that really nobody likes them for. Except they like the end result. The end justifies the means. And as shareholders, that's the kind of guy we want, don't we? We don't want some nice guy who's going to continue to run the company and have it continue to lose money, do we? That's the same thing that the Jewish people had out there. They wanted to be out from under Roman occupation. Would they rather have some guy who was peaceful, used words, and taught in these parables and stories? Or do you want some guy of action who's actually going to get out there and going to stand up to the Roman Empire? Would Jesus get it done? It was kind of a stacked deck when Pilate threw that out there. He didn't quite realize what he was offering up there. They wanted somebody who would go out and could get it done, who would stand up to the Roman Empire. And Jesus didn't really do that. So we have this situation where Pilate is now stuck. So he says, okay, I'll have him flogged and we'll release him. They said, no, we want him crucified. Crucify Jesus. And ultimately, Pilate washes his hands and says, this is not my will, this is not my decision, this is on y'all's head. And they said, fine. So now I want to come back to that question. Why do you believe Jesus was silent? Why wouldn't Jesus have defended himself? And I believe that it's because if Jesus would have tried to defend himself, he probably would have been successful. Jesus knew that this time, this moment, was his appointed destiny. This is what he was sent to earth for. If he had defended himself in any way, he could have stepped back and said, okay, Pilate, these guys, they don't like it because I'm over here challenging their authority. Pilate probably would have liked that. Some local guy who's challenging the Sanhedrin's authority. Yeah, keep out there. You keep at it. Let's undermine their authority a little bit. Let's undermine their power a little bit. Pilate might have been friends. But Jesus keeps his mouth shut. Jesus at any time could have gotten out of this. We talked about a couple of weeks ago how Jesus could have slipped out of the Garden of Gethsemane, gotten into the wilderness, and disappeared. He probably could have defended himself in front of the Sanhedrin. He could have defended himself in front of Herod. He could have defended himself in front of Pilate. But he didn't. Because he knew that he was here to fulfill prophecy. To be the one who died for all of us. To essentially be our scapegoat. The one who takes away all of our sin. And gives us a way to be reconciled to God. Jesus was very familiar with the scriptures of Isaiah. It is the most quoted book of the Old Testament that Jesus quotes from. In Isaiah, there is a long section in the 50s, particularly chapter 53, that talks about what is called the suffering servant. And when we hear the words of Isaiah 53, I don't know about you, but I can't help but see Jesus in that scripture. Jesus knew these scriptures and knew that he would be the suffering servant for all of us. That he was here to sacrifice himself for all of us. So Jesus did not defend himself because he came to lay down his life for us. A little later in our closing, we're going to have some time for prayer and reflection. The rail is open for you to come and for us to contemplate what Jesus really did for us. How he stayed silent, didn't defend himself,